The Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs advocate Sipho Mantula is with us today to talk about Africa Day today, a big day for the continent, or at least it should be. Advocate, a very good evening to you. Is it as big a deal as Africa Day should be?
Jambo Africa, Mbeki, Levin, to your viewers, good evening. Mbeki, I will start on a very low note to say that being the Liberation Day for the continent, 60 years, the 6 decades, many African countries, they don't really dedicate this day as a public holiday. That is worrying. It's a serious concern. Secondly, you'll understand, listening to a clip, when we were chairing the AU in 2020, the silencing of guns, it seems that was just rhetorical when we see the conflicts that are going on and the military coups. And secondly, when you look at the theme of the previous years, the one of last year was around the food security. We still have issues around food insecurity in the African continent. And thirdly, when you look at the continental free trade, I thought that the president also will take this opportunity to also speak in different African languages. I look at this attire, it was a serious concern also, you know. And another point, that if he speaks about Ukraine and Russia, when we have conflict in Sudan, when we have conflict in the Eastern DRC, what then is our role as South Africa or as Azania to deal with African conflicts and also the pressing challenges that are facing people of this beautiful continent? Hence, I say to Mbeki, it is important that once we solidify and we rubber stamp this Africa Liberation Day or Africa Day celebrations in Africa. And remember, South Africa is celebrating it as a month-long commemoration. Many African countries is just a one-day affair, like in Addis Ababa today. So if one looks at the question of the African continent and its challenges post the Berlin conference that I heard him speaking it just briefly, but also the moment of 1963 was very important because some of our people were there in the 1963 conference. People like Miriam Makeba were there. Many PAC and ANC leaders who were in exile, they were part of that session. So it is important, Mbeki, when we have to reflect on our continent, we should not also be pessimistic, because what I picked up today, I picked up hot air where people were pessimistic that do we even celebrate Africa Day? I will always say we should always reflect, introspect, reflect on the African challenges, but we look at opportunities and we also look at the wisdom of the founding fathers and the founding mothers of the African continent, which include Emperor Haile Selassie, Julius Nyerere, Nkrumah, Lumumba, Sokoture, Oliver Tambo, Robert Sobukwe, and there are many more, Mbeki. The list is endless, but it is important that we don't become pessimistic about this caged and this beautiful continent.
It is difficult, though, Advocate, is it not, to remain optimistic about the continent when so many of the previous ills and forms of strife haunt it today? You mentioned, for example, Sudan at the moment. Even a ceasefire that was supposed to facilitate humanitarian access is struggling to hold. You look at the CAR and conflict there. Parts of the DRC are still struggling. Much of Africa is still poor, even though it's rich in resources. So to say, let's, yes, reflect, but let's also be optimistic, becomes a bit of a hard sell, is it not, when so many Africans feel as though the odds are stacked against them?
No, correctly. But let us also unmask and decipher what has made Africa to be poorer, who has impoverished Africa, who have unjustly enriched Africa or unjustly enriched themselves. We still find the Western powers and the colonial powers as hidden hands in African conflicts. And also we see the deficit of African leadership. Hence I was raising the issue also, what defines us? One of the pillars of Agenda 2063 talks about our common identity, our common aspirations. And if you look also, Mbeki, it is the problem that we have leaders who don't have a pan-African vision. We have leaders who speaks Africa, but their mind is in EU and Europe. That is a problem we have. It's the same like the journalists and the media. We have the media that is based in Africa, but it wants to report Africa as if they are living outside Africa. And that's why we are having a serious concern. But in unmasking that, It is important that the present generation, the future generation, must not be told about only the bad things that happen in Africa,
Right.
but also what good has come out of Africa. Like if you think of the liberation of South Africa, the OAU Liberation Committee was part of that. If you think of the challenges that we see in many places where we had a one-party state, the African Union came up with a charter on elections, democracy, and governance. Hence, even Sudan is not being allowed to have a say at the AU. So that shows you that there's been a shift. Yes, we might be going at a slow pace, but I still say to you, we've got Western handlers within African institutions and African governments, and those handlers have to be unmasked if we have this time and this space.
I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm thinking of the period when there was talk of African solutions to African problems. And I'll reference again the situation in Sudan, the humanitarian ceasefire, and even longer-term efforts at peace currently seem to have been or are being spearheaded by the United States and Saudi Arabia. In fact, much of the talks we know have been happening in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, right? Yet you've got, in the coming weeks, a delegation of African leaders who will be on a trip to try and bring about peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I wonder how you read those two scenarios and whether we should compare at all.
No, definitely, Mbeki. I said to some of the ambassadors 2 days ago, I said one Latin concept says, "Pacif serves para bellum." If you're talking of peace, prepare for war. So if African leaders want to go to Ukraine, to Kyiv and to Moscow, they must prepare also those peace drums. They must be drumming for peace using the power of cultural diplomacy. And secondly, as you talk about the peace talks that are being in Jeddah, I think it has been an isolation of the Arab League and the two generals who are having proxy wars that they are fighting using those European countries. You will recall Egypt, the South Sudan, Ethiopia. They have also given their time to say we are willing to can mediate this conflict of the two generals who are obsessed with power and who were part of the era of Bashir. So if one looks at the African conflicts also, it is not only the Sudan that is at a ticking bomb. We are sitting with Cabo Delgado. We are sitting with the Eastern DRC. We are sitting with Somalia. And all these conflicts in Africa, it is also a matter of lack of knowledge, the deficit of African conflict resolution system, mechanism. And also we are having what I will call people who want to be on the front line, but if they don't look at the middle line and the back line of the African agency, what Africa needs to focus on, because it seems that we have been detoured in our thinking as Africans, and we are being pushed into other conflicts that are not related to us, despite that we know, me and you, we have touched at some point the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in terms of food security, in terms of oil, but that conflict also should have been dealt at the level of the UN, should have been dealt at the level of both countries reaching to one another. Now we are being pushed as African leaders to interfere in a conflict that is far away from us, but we are sitting with countries that are having serious challenges. We have elections coming into Zimbabwe. We must be worried. We have elections coming into DRC. We must be concerned. So for me, when we have to reflect on African body politics, African economy, African culture, we must always sensitize our viewers and listeners that we need to think twice and say, are we really having real revolutionaries here? Are we really having real leaders? Or we are only having handlers who are handling a Western agenda, but using a pretext and a preface of an African person. And that's why it is worrying. As I said, it is important that as we reflect on the 6 decades of the OAU, we look also at Agenda 2063. Right. It's almost a decade, since 2013. And I can tell you, we have not moved because we have allowed the Chinese to build us the AU building in Addis Ababa. We have allowed the Russians to dominate us, and we want to use the concept of political solidarity. So for me, it is a facade. It is something that doesn't make sense, that is common to an ordinary person.
And just on that, we talk about the celebration of Africa's liberation. Some have said that there's an economic colonization that is now taking place, because you've got these various superpowers or former superpowers globally basically competing for influence over Africa. You referenced the Chinese, reference to the Russians as well. There's been a reference to the Americans as well, as trying to basically institute some other form of control over Africa overall. Who then becomes responsible for making sure that that does not happen, that the relationship remains that of equals, as the various governments will tell you it is?
Mbeki, remember South Africa and many countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, we have been pushing for the reform of the United Nations. We have been pushing for the reform of the global system, the trade system. It is not only the issue of the currencies that are part of the current themes that are going, but I think the African citizens have to hold their governments accountable. And you know, one thing that is worrying is that the African leaders, we are not saying divorce yourself from international relations, but also make international relations national relations. Also domesticate public diplomacy. Hence, you find that even when you have to talk about the role of Africa in the global affairs, we find African leaders always rushing to this summit. And when they go to this summit, they are being treated as infants. They are being treated as minors who have to have consent before they get into those meetings. You recall the USA-Africa summit last year. You know that there's a Russia-Africa summit coming. There is the TICAD, which is of the Japanese, you have the Chinese. So for me, that when we go to those summits, we should not find ourselves selling out or also failing to can represent a common African agenda. Hence, it is important when African leaders, they go to this summit, they need to also get consultation. They don't consult, Mbeki. I can assure you, you hardly have consultation when our leaders goes to Geneva. They actually rush to Geneva for Human Rights Council rather than going to Gambia on human rights issues. And that is a serious concern. And as you said, politics, economy, it is dominating, but also there's a cultural domination by these Western powers.
Advocate Sipho Mantula, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time on this Africa Day.